Hello and welcome to this video from me, Joe Saxton at NFB Synergy. What I want to do over the next 10 minutes or so is talk you through some of the work that we've been doing recently about what the public thinks about what's happening with charities in the pandemic, but also talk through what I think some of the issues are and some of the solutions. So let's kick off with some of our recent research. The first thing that we've seen is that giving levels have fallen dramatically. Across all age groups, we're now down to 54% saying they've given in the last 3 months, whereas previously we were up around 69 or 70%. We've also seen volunteering falling amongst the older age groups in particular, though holding steady, even increasing amongst the younger age groups. Trust has actually fallen since last November. Now that in itself isn't particularly important, but it is an issue because for many other groups, supermarkets, small businesses, government, even banks, we've seen an increase in trust during the pandemic. And we can only conclude that's because people aren't seeing enough of charities and understanding the difference that they're making. And of course we've also seen a lot of charities who've seen their income decimated, their funding from government be put on hold, but in particular the fundraising activities are not looking nearly as strong, particularly for those organisations who have fundraising events, whether it's marathons or triathlons or anything that requires people to participate together. And all of this has left many charities with lost jobs, on the brink of bankruptcy, not being able to show they're going to continue their services. And of course this comes when many charities are seeing an increase in demand for their services. Well, what's behind all of this? Well, we think a lot of it is to do with the image problem for the charity sector. There's a gap between the perception and the reality. The perception is that charities are nice to have. Rishi Sunak called it the gentleness of charities. And actually, they're not gentle. They're doing amazing work up and down the UK in all sorts of ways, from the smallest community groups to the largest organisations. So the reality is very different from the perception. And we'll come back to some of that in a minute. But for many people, charities have been barely visible during the COVID pandemic. You don't hear much about them on the news compared to sports organisations or arts organisations, or the impact on airlines or the travel industry or pubs or hospitality. Now, of course, it's a big and competitive market, but there doesn't appear to be in any way that we can cut through to get a better coverage of the trials and tribulations that charities are facing. Behind all of that, particularly with this government, is that charities aren't seen to be particularly supportive of Brexit. There seem to be a group of Guardian-reading left-wing cabal who actually aren't particularly supportive of anything a Conservative government does. Now, for a whole variety of reasons that isn't true, but as in so many cases, perception is reality. They're seen almost as irrelevant, and Carl Wilding made that point, that while he was talking to government at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't that they were saying how vital charities are, they were saying how irrelevant they are. And we have, behind all of this still, is a pervasive set of stereotypes about charities, that they have charity chief executives who are paid too much, that actually they're all run by volunteers, that fundraising is extremely expensive, and all of those kind of things. And as long as some of those stereotypes persist, it's very difficult to get to see the real work that charities do and the critical part they play in UK society. So how did this image problem come about? Well, part of the problem is that tackling the image of charities as a whole is a huge task. And what that means is it's way bigger than any one individual charity, and it needs concerted effort. And it's been much easier to let the image issues drift, that many people have seen and known about for years, even decades. But also, in some cases, it's much more helpful for people not to understand that fundraising may cost 25% or more of the activities that are being fundraised for. It's much easier not to say this is what our charity chief executive earns, because you know people may not be happy with it. So there have been some strong reasons why actually it does make sense for charities individually to not do anything and collectively to let sleeping dogs lie. It isn't sensible in the long term, but in the short term we can see why it happens. But perhaps the real issue is there's little evidence of a strategy for tackling these big issues. Nobody seems to be sitting down and saying we have some big systemic problems in the charity sector that need to be addressed. And that's part of the problem, is that it requires people to work together. And on that basis, I would say that there's a poor track record of long-term sector collaboration on these kind of big mega issues that affect charities across the board. The sector can be very good at responding to short-term needs and specific issues, but much worse about tackling some of the big issues that actually require a long-term, intimate, collaborative response. And of course, nobody is responsible for the collective image. The irony, of course, is that you have lots of organisations who have their own brand managers who manage their own brands extremely carefully. But I would suggest that the collective image of charities is undermining some of those individual brand challenges. And without tackling the collective brand, it's very difficult for some of the individual brands to succeed. And I think there's been a mixed sector response to COVID. There have been some really good organisations doing fantastic stuff, but we haven't seen enough of what is it the sector wants, why are we needing money, what are the things. I went to look at the Nevermore Needed website recently, which is probably the flagship vehicle, and the reality is I could find only one fact about the problems that charities were facing, and very little on what the solutions are, other than charities are having a tough time. We need smarter, better goals if we're to overcome some of these issues. So where there's a gap between how an organisation is seen and wants to be seen, it's because, as we would put it, the brand doesn't do justice to reality. So what I'm suggesting is that this is a brand problem that charities have, that the overall brand and not the individual brands. And that until we start to tackle it as a brand problem, we're unlikely to make much progress. So the first thing we need is some clear and consistent messaging about what we want to say about charities. And these need to be pumped in, week out, year in, year out, probably decade in, decade out by charities, so we get the message across. First thing you want to say that charities do make a difference and give lots of good examples. People want to know that charities are cost effective. In our research, there's very little evidence that people can see the difference between those charities that are cost effective and aren't. They see them as all one fairly cost ineffective organisation. People need to also understand that charities are hugely diverse. The big ones are different from the little ones. The ones in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland or at the community or at the grassroots or tackling issues are all extremely different. But the reality is they're almost all doing an incredibly important job. The charity chief executives are comparatively poorly paid. When I look at what the chief executive of Oxfam or Macmillan gets, actually, for the complexity and range of tasks that they do, what they get paid, between £100,000 and £200,000, is a bargain. And less than we see many local authority chief executives get paid, less than many footballers get paid in a week, and less than the Prime Minister get paid in many cases. Charities are highly regulated. There's this kind of myth that goes around that charities don't have much regulation. In one of my calculations, we got to 15 different regulators for charities. Not just the Charity Commission or OSCA or whoever else it may be about the charity specifically, but also whether it's Ofsted, whether it's the CQC or whoever else it may be. People should worry about the impact of charities, not the admin. And that's for two reasons. Partly because charities are there to deliver impact, but also because, of course, there's no such thing as admin in the accounts. So it's not something you can look up and discover what is paid by an organisation, what percentage of its income goes in admin. And people should choose charities with a head and a heart. You cannot choose a charity on rationality alone, but you should also try and look at it from a rational point of view, saying what are the metrics that make this charity better than that charity. Alongside that clear and consistent messaging is making the case with evidence. There isn't enough evidence, there isn't enough stuff that if you're a politician or a journalist, you can get your hands into to understand the difference that is being made. We need to tackle some of those stereotypes about what a charity looks like and how it works. We need to understand all of that and put the case to politicians consistently, systematically and across the board. And we need to start normalising media coverage. What I mean by that is that actually there's very little routine coverage of charities. There are no charity correspondents. There may be education correspondents or sports correspondents or arts correspondents or any range of other things, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any kind of media outlet. Even the BBC doesn't have somebody whose job it is to understand and report on charities. And until we get that, people won't know the day in, day out stuff that charities do that make a difference. So what structure would you need to make a difference and to make this change happen? Well, firstly, we need to agree there is a problem. We need to agree that something needs to be tackling. And actually that in itself is quite an important goal. We need to set up some kind of steering group from people with great comms experience, with people who can look at how we get the messaging right, people who can look at what it is we need to do in the different parts of the communications tools of charities, whether it's fundraising, whether it's communications, whether it's service delivery. We need a strong, powerful steering group. And we need a brand manager who sits on top of all of that and delivers the goods. Some of this work was already started 10 years ago, 15 years ago, by the Institute of Fundraising and then by the Understanding Charities Group. But there's nothing like this at the moment now. We need goals and timescales. I think probably it's a 10-year task. But actually, had we started this work 10 years ago or continued it when it was happening, we would see a lot more progress now, because it's only by this long-term, persistent change about the way that charities are seen we're going to make a difference. And of course, we need resources. A lot of this isn't, though, just about money. It's about the resource to say we are going to make sure that all the big organisations say the same kind of things, use all of their outlets to put across some of the messages I've just talked about. That isn't necessarily expensive. It's more about discipline and consistency and focus. If we have that, we stand a better chance of making these things happen. So charities have the expertise to change their own brands. Now we just need to turn that expertise and experience to the sector as a whole. And people may think, but that's not my job, that's not what I should be doing. But I believe until we get the brand of charities overall changed in the public and political minds, we stand a chance of seeing individual charities' work being undermined because they're not doing a good enough job in the public eyes, even though individually they may be. The whole brand, the sector brand, is weakened to an extent that means individual brands are weakened as well. And that's why I think it's particularly important that we learn the lessons from COVID and make sure we say, okay, we've seen what happens when we don't have the right brand, and now we need to start doing something seriously and consistently to tackle the problem is in the image of charities and the way they come across in the public mind. You can also read my blog. You can also go to our website to download a range of free resources that we put out during COVID and before. They're all free, and I hope you find them useful. Thank you very much. I'm Joe Saxton from NFP Synergy.